Saul Eslake is an independent economist, joins us this morning. Saul, good morning to you.
Good morning, Leon. Thank you for having me on the program.
You raised the prospect 6 months ago that, quote, by some metrics, we could be heading for the worst financial position of any state or territory in the next 3 years, unquote. Does that seem more or less likely after yesterday's revised budget forecast?
It's more likely, I'm afraid to say. The revised estimates show that Tasmania's non-financial public sector as a whole, which includes the GBEs, Hydro Tasmania, TasNetworks and so forth, whose borrowings are, of course, guaranteed by the government of Tasmania, the non-financial public sector will run cash deficits equivalent to 5.5% of Tasmania's gross product over the 4 years to 2027-28. That is by far the worst of any jurisdiction. I mean, by comparison, Victoria, which has long been recognised as a financial basket case among Australia's states, that is planning to run cash deficits of about 2.5% of Victoria's gross product. Tasmania's public sector financial liabilities, which includes not just conventional debt, but also the unfunded superannuation liability, which has to be serviced in much the same way as conventional debt does, that's going to rise to 55% of Tasmania's gross product by the end of the 2027-28 financial year. The corresponding figure for Victoria and the Northern Territory is in the high 30s. So by those two metrics, which are ones that the rating agencies look at, Tasmania's finances are now headed for, and indeed in some respects already are, the worst of any state or territory.
So how do you contrast that with Treasurer Guy Barnett's approach to this, which is to say, yes, things are challenging, but everything's under control. We're on a pathway to surplus by 2029-30.
Well, the first thing I'd note is he hasn't produced any figures for what he expects for 2029-30 or indeed 2028-29, so he's asking us to take his word for it. Other jurisdictions, including in particular the federal government in their mid-year reviews, put out figures out to 2030, 34, 35, and one of my recommendations, which the government's explicitly rejected, is that they should do the same thing. When the Northern Territory Treasury can do this, and it presumably has fewer resources available to it than the Tasmanian Treasury, but the Tasmanian Treasury or the Tasmanian Treasurer refuses to do that. The second thing is that when Guy Barnett speaks, as all state treasurers do, about surpluses or deficits, what he's talking about is the so-called net operating balance. That's the difference between the revenue the state government gets from all sources and what it spends on so-called operating expenses, which are the costs of delivering services like schools and hospitals and police, interest on the state's debt, depreciation on the state's assets, things like that. It specifically doesn't include the government's very large capital expenditure or infrastructure spending program. It does, funnily enough, include the one-off grants the state government gets for capital purposes, even though that money is spent on capital expenditure. If you exclude that, the government is proposing to run an underlying so-called net operating balance of $4.1 billion over the 4 years to 2027-28. That's more than $700 million more than they were forecasting back in September. But if you look at the cash balance, which I would argue you should for two reasons, that's because that's what we look at when we talk about the federal budget. You know, when Jim Chalmers talks about having run two surpluses in a row, he's talking about the cash surplus. When he admits that the federal budget is going into deficit in the current financial year and for the next 8 years, he's talking about the cash deficit. The government is forecasting cash deficits totalling $4.6 billion over the 4 years to 2027-28. That's $800 million more than they were forecasting over the same interval in September last year. There is no credible path back to a cash surplus in any of the numbers that were presented by the Treasurer yesterday. Okay. And you have to have a cash surplus in order not to be adding to debt year by year, let alone to begin to be paying it back.
On Mornings Around Tasmania, Saul Eslake's our guest this morning. As I said, it was a big day for numbers yesterday. We did ask Treasurer Guy Barnett on the program this morning to explain the state's budget position and how he is convinced they'll, quote, deliver a net operating surplus by 2029-30. Is the government just pretending that there's going to be a surplus, Saul Eslake? Is it just spin?
Well, in the absence of any information to the contrary, And I emphasise that one of my recommendations was that the government should have put out numbers over the 10-year period, not for everything in the budget, but for the key aggregates, total spending, total revenue, the so-called net operating balance, and the one that really matters, the cash surplus or deficit. They should put those numbers out, like the Federal Treasury does, and like in some respects the Northern Territory Treasury, among others, does. In the absence of those...
Yeah, and so to the question, is this just, as far as you can see, and based on your experience, spin? Are they just pretending there'll be a surplus because the politics look good, on your assessment?
Well, they may be. I mean, I don't want to accuse the Treasurer or anyone else of telling lies. I don't have any evidence for that. What I do say is that on the basis of publicly available information, there is no credible path back to a cash surplus, which is what's needed if debt is to stop rising and if some start is to be made on paying some of it down. There's no credible path to a cash surplus. And frankly, I don't see how you can get to a cash surplus without some combination of cuts in spending, increases in taxation, both of which the government has ruled out, scaling back of the infrastructure spending program, which they also refuse to do, and or selling government assets in the way that Jeff Kennett and Alan Stockdale did in Victoria in similar circumstances some 30 years ago, which they've also ruled out, except on a very small scale. So I don't know how you can get to a credible cash surplus under what the government is doing, or more importantly, what it's not doing. The best I can say is that based on the quarterly numbers that are buried in the report that was released yesterday, the deterioration in Tasmania's financial position, which has been going on since well before COVID, as I documented in my review, that may have run its course. The deficits may be bottoming out, but I don't believe that current policy settings will deliver a cash surplus by 2029-30. Indeed, I don't believe they'll deliver a cash surplus by 2034-35.
It's an interesting position to be in. People can see the government's response to your report and indeed find your report very easily up online, having a look at the state of the state's finances. Saul Eslake, appreciate you talking with us this morning.
That's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Independent economist Saul Eslake.